Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Joining us once again is Richard Wolff. You know the highlights. He has hosted Economic Update on Free Speech TV. He is an economist and an economic historian and a professor at more than one place. And his latest book is The Sickness is the System. We always enjoy speaking with him. So first of all, Richard Wolff, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thank you, RJ. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. And everybody's talking inflation, including the President of the United States, who the other day had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which I'm sure you saw, called, well, they gave it the headline, "My Plan for Fighting Inflation." And let's start with this, since we're going to talk about inflation. I was very surprised. Maybe I'm conjugating the sentence wrong or parsing it wrong, but I was very surprised to read this sentence from the President of the United States. It reads as follows. First, the Federal Reserve has a primary responsibility to control inflation. Now, I was confused about this sentence for a couple of reasons. One is and the first reaction was, I've been told for all sorts of years now that the Fed has a dual responsibility, and that dual responsibility is to control inflation and to keep people working, and keep jobs and inflation in some kind of balance, which may be its own ideological vision. I don't know. So I was doubly confused, one, because he left out the jobs part, and two, because primary is a funny word, Richard Wolff. It could mean that he's washing his hands of it, which is what it sounds like to me. Like he's saying, well, these guys have got to do it. And, if I were in a position of influence of some kind, I might, have more to say about it, but I'm going to drop it in their laps. So first of all, can you help me at all with my confusion in interpreting the president?
No, I think your confusion is perfectly in order. I share most of what you just said. Let me add a couple of things as well. There are ample examples, and I'd like to talk about them, of presidents of the United States, and I will mention only two because they were dramatic: Franklin Roosevelt during World War II and Richard Nixon in 1971, who took much more dramatic action. In the case of Roosevelt, to prevent an inflation, and in the case of Nixon, to bring a terrible inflation to a halt. These are presidents like Biden. They were a president when there was the Federal Reserve, just like Biden. They stepped in and made interventions, and that's what Biden is either unable or unwilling to do. And he ought to own up to the fact that, as one nasty comment that I read said, he had offered us a nothing burger. I found that a kind of wonderful way of summarizing it. The second comment I would make is that the job of the Federal Reserve is not to control the inflation. Everybody understands the job of the Federal Reserve is to prevent an inflation and make sure one doesn't happen. If for some reason something happens and they don't get to do that, number one, that's a failure. But they can recoup themselves by being quickly able to bring it back close to zero, because the phrase usually used to describe the Federal Reserve's job is to, quote, maintain price stability. That's the language in which this is discussed throughout the literature. And so what we're seeing here is a crude magician's effort in the face of an obvious failure to prevent one, because we're right in the middle of it, an obvious failure to get rid of it once it was underway, because we've had this inflation now a good year. And instead, we're substituting this funny word, control an inflation, which, by the way, they haven't done either, because what would that mean? Keep it at 2%? Keep it at 3%? certainly can't mean keep it at 8%, which is where it has been now for several months, etc. So for me, this speech, and indeed what they're doing, is effectively doing nothing, throwing lots of words around there of good intentions and what we should be doing and this and that, but there's no plan at all, which is why I think the phrase nothing burger, you're given a package, it looks like a hamburger, it looks like what you ordered, but as you unwrap it, it's two pieces of bread, and between them, there's nothing. And that's kind of what this was, and there's no excuse for it, since there really are, and I'd like to talk with you about them, things that have been done in other countries faced with this situation, and things that have been done here in the United States, none of which are being discussed, none of which are being explored, and none of which are being undertaken.
Well, I would love to talk to you about what we can do, because it seems to me that inflation has become a kind of, they say black box in programming and analysis. Oh, we don't know what that, it's just a thing. And so we have to do a thing to address it. It's a macro thing. So we have to do macro things. It can't, there's no sense. It might be made up of moving parts, and it might be that you could break it apart and do this about this and that. There's a kind of magical thinking. Now, Richard Nixon, you mentioned, and, it may be that our president is acknowledging that he's not as politically left as Richard Nixon. That's certainly likely, but it seems to me that's, he imposed wage and price controls, as I recall. And it seems to me that that's treating it as more than just a black box. It's like, here are some things we can adjust to take to address the problem. Am I off base in my approach?
No. Let's briefly go through it, because if we're concrete, I think people will understand. Let's start with Richard Nixon. You brought him up. He's a Republican. We all remember that, right? He pretty conservative as Republicans went in those days. Maybe not today, but in those days. So here we are, August 15th, 1971. He goes on radio and television as the president and announces not a control, the way Mr. Biden talks about what the Fed does. No. And he doesn't invoke the Fed. He says, I, as president, am hereby using my authority to establish what was in fact a wage price freeze. And to make clear what he meant, he said, as of tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, that would be August 16th at 8 o'clock, if you are a business and you raise your price, if you're an employer who has the authority to raise prices, and just as a footnote, let's all remember, price setting is a prerogative of the employer. Employers constitute less than 1% of the American people. The other 99% are not in a position to set a price, neither to raise it nor to lower it. They are price takers. Employers are price makers. So if you're upset about a price, if you want to control the price, you have to control the people who set them, and that's the private capitalists and the private employers of the businesses that are the dominant part of our economy. President Nixon tells them, if any of you raise the price tomorrow at 8 o'clock, I'm going to have you arrested and you're going to jail. If you are a union or a worker and you demand or push for higher wages, same thing. The prices are frozen, the wages are frozen. And they were, and that was originally set for several months. It was extended and so on. And guess what? It took an inflation that was worse than the one we have now, or at least the one we have right now, may yet get the other way, and it stopped it in its tracks. So the notion that there's nothing you can do about an inflation is proven stone cold wrong by a Republican president. And I want to stress here that Mr. Biden and Janet Yellen and whoever else is advising them have not said a word about a wage price freeze, have not initiated or participated in a conversation about the pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses of invoking a wage price freeze, and it has strengths and weaknesses vis-a-vis those of keeping the inflation, which is a logical conversation we ought to have if we're going to choose among alternatives. But they don't want us to do that, which is why they're pretending that they don't have this on the agenda, that there's only one thing to do, and that's to go with the Federal Reserve plan of raising interest rates. Now, I don't mind telling you, I may have in the past, Janet Yellen and I were classmates at Yale University getting our PhDs in economics at the same time. She knows what happened in August of 1971. That was shortly around the time we finished our studies there. I had the same professors she did. I took the same courses she did. I got the same degree she did. She knows. Why she's not saying a word about it, I won't speculate, but the notion that there's a political motive there should occur to any reasonable person. The second example is in a way just as dramatic. This time it's World War II. It's the early 1940s. The president is a Democrat, Franklin Roosevelt, and he's terribly worried, this time not about an existing inflation, but one he knows is coming. He's terrified that an inflation during the war will divide the country. Because, you know, an inflation is a very socially divisive phenomenon for a simple reason. As the prices go up, the people who aren't rich have a harder and harder time affording them. Eventually, as the prices keep going, the poor and the middle fall away. They literally can't buy the stuff anymore. So who gets whatever is scarce is the richest amongst us. And if you think that doesn't cause bitterness, anger, envy, then try to imagine what happens if you go to the store to buy milk for your children, but it now costs $12 a quart, and only the rich folks down the road who buy the milk for their kitten will be able to get it. You won't. Okay? Roosevelt saw this coming. Why? Because resources in America that had been going to produce consumer goods had been redirected to produce for the war, to fight against the Japanese in the Pacific, the Germans and Italians in Europe, and so on. And therefore, with much reduced resource flow to producing consumer goods, it was obvious to everyone that a supply shortage of consumer goods would lead, if you let the market work, to the bidding up of the price, which would end up allocating the scarce consumer goods to the richest people. You cannot afford social division if you're fighting World War II and your survival is at stake. So guess what they did? They didn't just go and say, I'm going to control the inflation. No. And they didn't do a price wage freeze a la Mr. Nixon. They did something more dramatic and more intrusive. They said, from now on, you're not going to be able to buy anything of the following list of basic items, which included things like coffee, sugar, meat, milk, gasoline for your car, and a whole bunch of other things. You're not going to be able to buy them with money. They're no longer, you can bid whatever you want, but whatever you bid, you're not getting it. Because we're issuing ration books out of which you tear little coupons. And each coupon entitles whoever has it to get a quart of milk. Without that coupon, you're not getting the milk. Whatever the price in money is of the milk doesn't matter. You will get that milk if you have the coupon. That's called a rationing system. It was used successfully in the United States. It meant that the goods that were scarce were distributed according to who had the ration cards, not according to who had how much money. And the government distributed the ration cards, and I know you and I have smiled about this in the past, on the theory it should be distributed according to their needs.
Exactly.
You had a lot of children, you got more milk coupons than if you had no children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, let me be very, very concrete now. The Federal Reserve for the last 20 years has been pumping huge amounts of money into the economy. Okay, we all know that that happened, and we all know that we've been wondering sooner or later, with all of this money creation, aren't we at risk of an inflation? We were able to stave it off for a while, and we can talk about why that happened, but for the moment, we staved it off. Now we don't stave it off anymore. But let me give you a simple solution. You pump money into the economy, and at the same time, you put on a wage price freeze. Why? Because look at the combination. Every storekeeper, every producer, knowing that the economy has more and more money in the hands of people who can buy things, will not be able to respond to the rising amount of money by jacking up the prices, because that's forbidden. So the only way to respond to all the people who have money to spend would be to order more product. You make your living selling more product. Therefore, you order it from the factory, and therefore there are more jobs to produce because you have constrained the system. You're not allowing the 1% of our people who are employers, business owners, and operators. You're saying to them, this is too important. We're not going to leave it up to your preferences whether you respond to more money in the system by raising prices or offering more goods for sale. We're not giving you the first option because that produces an inflation, and that's damaging to the society. So on grounds of what the society needs, wage price freeze plus an increase in monetary purchasing power gets you what you want. More goods produced, more jobs making them. And there are 25 variations of what I've just said. And I'm not even asking anyone, not you, RJ, or anyone listening or watching. You don't have to agree with me, but you do have to recognize that I'm simply describing well-known, historically repeated ways of coping with inflation, and we're not discussing any of them in this society. We are treated to Republican and Democrats as if turning it over to the Federal Reserve, which just failed at what it's supposed to do, is the only thing we can do, and the only thing they can do is raise interest rates. And let me warn everyone, and I mean it as a warning, we've just put the American working class through an unspeakable trauma of 1 million dead people from COVID, and we're not out of the woods yet. We have also subjected them to an economic crash over the last 2 years, second only to the Great Depression of the 1930s. We are now whacking them again, this time with an inflation. And what are we going to do? Hit them again with rising interest rates, which make using your credit card more expensive, which make your car payments more expensive, your mortgage more expensive, and is a hammer blow against the future of jobs in this country. And everything I'm telling you is already admitted by our leaders, but they don't seem to think it's going to make any difference, that there won't be a political backlash, which I assure you there will be, because we already have that. The divisions in this country, the bitterness, even the shootings. We are putting people under unspeakable pressure, finding them no relief at all, and then wondering why the society appears to be blowing itself apart.
And it seems to me that the method for doing this, for one, is a kind of historical amnesia, is what you've described. And, it helps me understand this black boxness of the way we treat inflation. And we're also turning it over to an unelected body of, I guess I would say, bureaucrats at the Fed who are deeply embedded within. At one point, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, was the head of the salary and compensation. It was called Compensation Committee of the Federal Reserve. I mean, think about that, right? So we're dealing with a body closely entwined in many ways with Wall Street and with that level of thinking, even the best of them. But you've identified several tools that have been used in the past to address that. And among them, let's see, FDR, Roosevelt used suppression of demand or control of demand based on need. Nixon used this imposition of wage and price controls to limit inflation on the price side. Assuming that these and other tools remain available, or of course, they could be reinstated by Congress at any time if they're not. But what could our leaders do? It seems to me we have an inflation right now that it seems, as I look at it, to have multiple factors, right? To have, there are aggregate demand questions, there are specific supply chain problems, there is excessive profit taking by corporations, there is the tiniest remediation, but nowhere near effective, of maybe working people who were 10 feet underwater, now they're 3 feet underwater, but they're still drowning. But, and that seems to be what people are fixated on in Washington. But what are some of the practical tools that we have in our tool chest to do something about the inflation we have today?
Well, I mean, I would argue that rationing and wage price freezes are tools we have available today. They've been used in the past. They could be imposed now. Not only do we have precedent in this country to do it, we have experience in this country. We have experience in many other countries that have, at comparable times, had to take these kinds of steps. In other countries, it's often called an incomes policy, when you freeze wages and prices so that everybody's income is kind of constrained, but we do it for everybody in the name of defeating the inflation. I would argue all of those are tools. We should be having a national debate about all of them, weighing who's benefited, who's hurt, and how can we manage a fair combination of those tools, for example. All of that should be done. None of it is happening. We have an ideological taboo. Everything has to be done by the market, without recognizing that the market is what got us here. Everything is to be done by private enterprise without understanding that's what got us here. And so you can't do anything. And by the way, this breeds a mysticism. It breeds a nihilism. Let me give you a couple of examples because people should understand this. One of the mysticisms is to say, gee, the inflation is happening in part because there are disruptions to our supply chains. This is a little bit like answering the question, why do we have a terrible storm? And being told clouds formed. Hello, clouds formed all the time, was nothing new. Every capitalist who's ever had to buy inputs to whatever it is he or she makes knows that if you buy them, they come from somewhere and they have to travel from wherever they're produced to where you use them as an input. And that's a supply chain. It could be 10 miles long. It could be 10,000 miles long. That's usually dictated to the profit decisions that all the players in this game have undertaken. Like, for example, the companies who now have long supply chains because they make more profit by having stuff made in China or India or Brazil or something like that. every capitalist since day one understands that supply chains get disrupted. A snowstorm can do that. A political turmoil can do that. Workers on strike can do that. Trucking breakdowns can do it. Electrical, I could go on all night. Every capitalist who isn't a moron, and we don't see them anymore because they go out of business, knows you have to take steps to anticipate and manage the disruptions. You have a stockpile in a warehouse somewhere. You have a plan B. If one mode of transportation is broken, you shift to. You do that because otherwise you risk going out of business when these disruptions happen. For us to be told by otherwise intelligent men and women that we today have an economy that's out of control, say because of its inflation, because we have supply chain disruptions, I mean, I don't know whether to start laughing or to realize that things are much worse in this culture than I understood, because we're reverting to mechanisms that explain exactly nothing. The interesting question isn't, do we have supply chain disruptions? Because the answer is, as with rain, yep, we have them all the time. That's how the world works. The only interesting question is, why would American capitalism be so incapacitated as to cope with them, having been relatively more capacitated in the past when we suffered all kinds of disruptions? Let me remind you, if a disruption happens now in the Suez Canal, people who need to know that know it within seconds. The internet does that. We have all manner of coping with disruptions we never had before. So it is peculiarly odd that now the disruptions seem to overwhelm us. This is, if you pardon my Spanish, bullshit. And we should recognize that when that comes from responsible officials, the translation of it is, we don't know what to do. We can't figure out what the problem is. We're hamstrung politically from doing whatever it is we imagine we might do. So all we're going to give you is lots of word salad. And if you read President Biden's speech the other day, it was verbiage from beginning to end. He has no plan in that speech. There is no plan. He is confident that the Federal Reserve, which has just allowed an inflation it's not supposed to, and did not foresee the crash of 2008 and 9, did not solve that in any quick way either. So you're turning this over to an institution in which he proudly dictates how faithful, how much faith he has in it, and the rest of us are left scratching your head. What? There's nothing there. And when there's nothing there, if I may borrow from your image, let's move the curtain so that the real public who's running this show can be revealed, because the people talking to us are talking junk.
And since everybody talks about, in public life, talks about supply chains nowadays, when the topic of inflation comes up, let's use just an example of the tools you've mentioned. If we were to set wage and price controls, let's say, right now, a corporation that has supply chain problems charges more for its product. In many cases, we've seen that their profits aren't hurt. Maybe they even go up because they can charge more than they're losing in volume. So there we have it. And if we had wage and price controls, they would not be able to profit from their own self-created supply chain problems, their lack of, we all know just in time and all these different things, these and long, offshoring of production and so on. So if they were to actually lose a lot of money because they, part of their profit taking was not protecting themselves from supply chain disruptions, it would be interesting to see what happened then.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it?
Absolutely. If the supply chain disruption hurt their profits, they would be busy getting in there and doing what, of course, they learned back in business school they were supposed to do. They were supposed to have stockpiles. So if there was an interruption, they could keep servicing their clients without, this is childish junk. Maybe they were so stupid and then, of course, why are we letting them run our businesses? If they didn't build a plan B, if they didn't have the stockpiles, in other words, if they didn't do what successful capitalists have always done to manage their supply chain disruptions, well, then they've just forfeited their right to be in a decision-making position with something as important as the products, the goods and services we need. And let's put that failure on the table, because that might raise the question, why in the world are we allowing entities whose number one goal is to make profit make decisions that have these results? Look, here's the ugly reality. If you restrict supply of anything, the laws of supply and demand that we all understand indicate that the price is going to go up because the scarce supply forces those who want it to bid against each other to get the supply that's scarce. So it drives up the prices. At that point, every capitalist asks the same question. All right, the bad news is I'm going to sell fewer products. The good news is I'm going to sell them at a higher price. I keep raising the price so long as the gain to me from doing that is larger than the loss I face by selling fewer objects. So you might understand what's going on as large numbers of corporations figuring out that they're going to do better selling fewer things at a higher price than selling more things at a lower one. And they're behaving accordingly. And that would make sense if you think about it, because we are decimating the purchasing power of the lower 2/3 of our people. We've been doing it for 40 years. They can't survive. And we don't care as an economic system. If the jobs go to China and it's more profitable, so be it. If the jobs are automated out of existence, so be it. And if that leaves large numbers of people unable to pay what is a profitable price, no matter. We have enough people who can pay the higher price that this is possible. That's the way capitalism works. And if I have any conclusion to ask people to think about, is that if you don't question and challenge the way capitalism works, then you haven't understood how these different parts fit together. You keep dreaming that if we plug the hole over here, if we reform over there, if we fix it over here, we're not at that. We've been doing that. We're beyond that. It's like going to the doctor and he has to give you the bad news. And you say, okay, I understand that. How many more Band-Aids do I need? And he has to explain to you 10 times. We're beyond Band-Aids, John. We need to do other interventions. The Band-Aid is no longer, that's what we got. That's what we have.
And, we haven't even had a chance to talk about baby formula in a country that lets one company with one factory produce 42% of its baby formula. Then when they mismanage it and poison gets in to the factory, then everything goes to hell. Joe Biden says he's going to use the Defense Production Act to get everybody baby formula. That hasn't happened, but which raises another interesting question. If he can do that for baby formula, why can't he do it for vaccines? Why can't he do it for all the other goods and services that people need? Why can't the government produce the stuff we need? And but that's my closing thought, and I'll give you yours.
My thought would be if it's bad to have one or two companies in control of the bulk of something, I got news for you. We have lots of industries in the United States with exactly that situation. And we ought to wonder, has the Biden administration or anybody done a survey? Do we have a standby plans if what happened to baby infant formula happens to XYZ other industry? Do we have an apparatus to know it, to act on it, to take steps now? Nothing. You all know the answer. We're living in a society where, as Damian Lee, the Golden State Warrior basketball player, told us the other day, this is a country in where it's easier to get a gun to kill people than it is to get infant formula to build the next generation. That's not a problem of this or that detail. That's a problem of a system that has broken down.
And we'll have to leave it on that note, but we do have tools. And so positive outlook is someday maybe we'll remember those tools and think of some more and do something other than this quasi-mystical, Oracle of Delphi approach to the Federal Reserve. So Richard Wolff, economist, historian, and author, as always, great talking with you, and thank you for your insights.
Thank you, RJ, and I look forward to talking with you again soon.
As do I. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.